Hi, my name is Vivian Agnew, and I'm a student coordinator of the American Democracy Project, and I'd like to welcome you guys today to one of our final Times Talks. We have another one tomorrow, but Times Talks are just short presentations that the American Democracy Project facilitates with the help of the library throughout the year to sort of give you guys some information about some topics that some of our faculty, staff, and students feel are important and worth your time. And today we have a Times Talk from Dr. Rose Helens-Hart, who is an assistant professor of applied business studies, and she's going to give you guys the business case for gay rights in the workplace. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all for attending. You never really know what the turnout's going to be and the interest level of your personal research interests, so I'm so happy to see that all of you found it provocative enough to come out and listen to me today. So 89% of Fortune 500 companies prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in their workplaces. And recently, just last year, ExxonMobil rejoined the ranks of these companies to amend its EEO, or Equal Employment Opportunity Policies, to now include sexual orientation as a protected class of people. And so this change was the topic of the New York Times article that I chose to base my talk on today. And so for about the next 30 minutes, I'll be discussing some of the contexts of equal opportunity related to LGBTQ individuals in the workplace, and then be talking about the business case for gay rights, which is kind of the colloquialism I use here, as it relates to ExxonMobil and its recent changes, and then touch upon my own research interests that also relate to this topic, leaving ample time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and move on to the first issue of context. So how many of you have heard of the term heteronormativity? Okay, a couple of people. Can anyone offer what they think that means?
I got you.
Okay, what does heteronormativity mean to you?
If you're really talking about hetero, you're talking about sexual orientation, and you're saying that that's the normal basis that we rely on, fundamentally.
Exactly. And so a lot of workspaces in the United States, whether or not they have protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, are considered heteronormative, meaning there's a large assumption that the people in that workplace are straight or are attracted to people of the opposite sex. And while this may seem like a safe assumption given that LGBTQ people are a minority in the United States, it does a few things for the experience of those people within those workplaces. If you look at the image I have on the slide here, it says family-friendly parking and has the stick figure of a man and a woman and 2 children. This is an example of what we consider a heteronormative image because it's suggesting to us that the family unit would be comprised of an opposite-sex couple. And we know that's not necessarily true, as many individuals who are in same-sex relationships have children or define family in other ways. So it's subtle cues like this and policies and practices within heteronormative workspaces which can essentially deny individuals the ability to experience the workplace and conduct their work in equal ways than other people who do not fall within that identity category. The second concept I want to talk to you about is a meritocracy. So in the United States, we have a strong assumption that we will be rewarded upon the hard work we put into something and our merits and our talents. And we may think this can help us avoid discrimination because we're only looking at the product of somebody's work, what they do in the workplace. And when we hold this assumption, what we are necessarily doing, in some cases, is refusing to look at the circumstances that can make it different for one person to come to their full potential within a workspace. So if you experience fear in your workspace, or you're worried about harassment, or you're at least stressed because you know so-and-so doesn't like you on the basis of something that you strongly hold to your own identity, such as sexual orientation, you may not have the ability to perform as well and exercise your talents as somebody who's free of those concerns within the workplace. So sexual minorities are often referred to as invisible minorities, and that a lot of people are very practiced at passing. Now certainly in more recent years, as gay rights movements gain momentum, people are feeling more comfortable with expressing themselves and making identity displays in whichever way they feel is most comfortable to them. We also know that there is this fear that if I am seen, I am opening myself up to potential instances of discrimination and stress and all these other things that we try to avoid when we're trying to get our work done. And so because sexual minorities have often been seen as invisible, the idea that they need to be attended to or protected or have their experiences considered has often been overlooked. And we know that people can experience exclusion, they can purposefully disengage because they don't want to work with people who don't like them or they fear that they will not be treated equally. They can experience ridicule, harassment, you can experience reduced productivity and all these things that don't make for the most productive workplace and the happiest employees. Now, when I say these things, I do want you to recognize that this is not all workplaces, and obviously different organizational cultures will affect people's experiences depending on where they are, but as a large generalization of the problems that LGBTQ employees may face, this is a kind of conceptualization of what we have going on in the research. So this is a map of the United States, and the states in red are the ones where there is no employment non-discrimination law. So you can see that Kansas is in red here, meaning that organizations would have the ability to fire you without recourse for being gay. Now, with that being said, organizations can take it upon themselves to have equal opportunity employment policies in place, like Fort Hays State University, for example. I was just speaking to HR this morning, talking to them about how they've handled employment since the passage of gay marriage, and they said, well, we now have to fall under federal law, and so if someone were to come and file for benefits for their spouse, they would have to grant it. And Fort Hays does recruit with the policy that there is no discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and then a number of other listed categories. So even though some states may be in red, we know that organizations are taking steps further in a lot of cases to attempt to accommodate and protect people from discrimination. Okay. So social justice and firm competitiveness are the two major areas of argument that are put forth to really advance this idea that people should be protected against discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation. And before I really go in and explain either of these to you, I wanted to see what some of the arguments you all have heard about granting protections and protecting people from discrimination. And again, these don't have to be arguments that you necessarily believe, but I want to hear the arguments that you've heard. A couple volunteers? Have you not heard of arguments against discrimination? You can think about other ones in general for diversity, if you're having a hard time thinking of one for...
There's the argument that there's no protected rights for straight people, so why should we have protected rights for gay people?
Mm-hmm. Any arguments for why we would want non-discrimination on the basis of orientation?
Like that's like more diverse groups of people are different backgrounds, and so different backgrounds bring different things to a table to make an organization more like holistically effective and better market itself to different groups of people.
Mm-hmm. One more. Give me one more. Yes.
Well, fundamentally, a lot of people are brought up on the Bible, and you're in part of the Bible Belt right here. You're looking at a generation around us that have seen eroding standards, and it's always been the standard, okay? Pretty much, at least in the Judeo-Christian settings. Now, as a government, we've kind of set that aside, and beliefs don't count for anything in the political arena, so to speak. As such, you know, we're looking at protection for people, making it equal from all angles. And so, you know, the social justice is making some changes. However, those that still have a belief structure can still judge through that lens, and that's what creates some of the friction ends up for discriminating circumstances?
So I'm hearing arguments that fall into both of these categories here. Let's start off with the social justice one. The easy way to think about this set of arguments is that protecting people against discrimination is the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. It's the good thing to do. And some might argue it's the Christian thing to do because you're supposed to be kind to your neighbors. So a lot of that argument is founded upon moral beliefs of equality and justice and fairness. Now, the firm competitiveness argument we heard from over here, and that we say, okay, well, you know, it's good to be a good person, it's good to be a good corporate citizen, but when it comes down to it, if we have diversity within our organization, and we're specifically talking about sexual orientation, but the business case is a broader set of arguments applying to a lot of different diverse factors. If we have diverse groups, we can be more innovative, we can be more creative, and that influences the bottom line of the organization, meaning we're going to be more competitive in the long run. So this is the business case. So the improved treatment of individuals will benefit the bottom line, and it benefits in a few different ways. First, we might have the likelihood to attract and keep better qualified employees. Right? Now, the reason why we say attract and keep is because those are two different issues. One, we're talking about recruiting. And if you are a highly employable petroleum engineer, for example, and you might have your choice of firms to work for, BP, Exxon, Chevron, all these opportunities for you, you are more likely to go to the firm, or I should say, one of the influencing factors of your choice may be that you know that you have some sort of recourse if you're discriminated against, or that your partner will receive benefits whether or not you're married, or they will recognize your marriage regardless of which company you're operating in, because we know that Exxon is a multinational company and a lot of firms are. So we would be able to better attract those people if we have fairer policies. And it doesn't even limit, only go to the people whose identity fits those policies. As somebody who may not identify as a minority in any way, you might still choose to affiliate yourself with a firm that you believe is a better corporate citizen. So the idea that you're going to be able to attract better qualified candidates is going to give you a competitive edge. And keep is important because even if somebody comes to your firm knowing that they don't have that sort of protection, if they experience something negative in the workplace or find the corporate culture offensive or limiting or hindering in some way, they're more likely to leave your organization. And the cost of turnover can be very significant for organizations if you have a massive exodus of people who now believe this is not the place that I want to be known to work for, or this place is treating me unfairly. So this is a big cost issue when it comes to keeping qualified candidates. It also goes into relating to diverse customers. Anyone heard of market segmenting? I can't say that word. Segmenting. All right, so the idea that you're trying to hone in on specific parts of the market for whatever product. Now break yourself out of the Exxon idea here for a second and think about different products and services you could deliver to a population. The idea here is that, well, if you have, and we'll just say, people who are LGBTQ in your firm, and you want to market to that certain population, they are going to have a better ability to know what that market wants. That's the logic, okay? That they can better suit and understand these customers. And finally, the argument we heard earlier, we have diversity of opinions, diverse ways of thinking, diverse backgrounds. We're going to be more innovative and more competitive. Now, do any of these not sit particularly well with anybody? Make you a little uncomfortable?
Maybe relating to diverse customers sounds a little bit more like it's sort of exploitive of a population of people who haven't been marketed to super often. But
we're saying like that's your only value. is that you identify as a lesbian or you identify as a queer person or something like that. Okay. So we're gonna demonstrate some criticisms to this in a little bit here, but I just wanted to present those to you to start off with. So summarizing what the business case for including diversity in businesses. So let's hear a little bit more about history of ExxonMobil and why they were the topic of this New York Times article. In 1999, when Exxon and Mobil merged, they were one of the few Fortune 500 companies to actually amend their EEO policies and reduce protection for a class, which was sexual orientation. So they decided to no longer offer benefits for domestic partnerships and same-sex couples for new employees. Old employees were grandfathered into the system, and that was no longer seen as a protected class. And the reasoning for this from the board of directors was that based on existing all-inclusive zero-tolerance policies, the board believes the proposal is unnecessary. So they thought, we don't need to single out any particular groups, we just don't discriminate, period. And it's been noted that Exxon has a very competitive organizational culture that says we reward people on the basis of their product, their work, and their talent, and we don't look at anything else. Problem is after this, Exxon got into a lot of trouble, a lot of lawsuits were levied against the firm as being discriminatory. So even though they were trying to talk the talk, they were not walking the walk, and they had a big reputational crisis on their hands. And in addition to that, the Corporate Equality Index from 2015 and several years before that gave them the lowest possible ranking an organization could receive when it came to the treatment of LGBTQ individuals. Now, to give you an idea of how these rankings are determined, because clearly this organization does have an agenda for protecting equality of rights. But some of the things that they looked at were whether or not the organization prohibited discrimination in EEO policies, whether or not they offered partnered benefits, and again, this was before same-sex marriage had become legalized, whether or not the firm had competency and diversity awareness programs, whether or not they positively engaged with LGBTQ communities, and whether or not they had a large-scale, this is their words, large-scale anti-LGBT blemish on their reputation. So the last one, the blemish one, was actually negative points. Everything else, if you didn't have it, you got 0 points. But if you had that last one, you got negative points. And so that's how they ended up with a negative rating. But they've made a lot of changes in 2015, which makes the 2016 index interesting because they might actually change in their rankings. So let's talk about some of the things that they've changed. Again, this is coming from the New York Times article, Plodding Along on Gay Rights, which I think that people will have access to online perhaps if they want to read it, but if not, you can find it in the citation there. So the article starts off with ExxonMobil employees being able to march in a Houston gay rights or gay pride event. And this was the first time employees had been able to march under the ExxonMobil banner. And this was pretty significant for people because they're saying finally we're being recognized by the organization being allowed to do this. In addition, in 2015, ExxonMobil actually recruited at an MBA event specifically for LGBTQ individuals. They amended their anti-discrimination policy, and they were a sponsor of an Out and Equal Workplace Summit. So if you think back to those measurements that the index was using before with engaging with the community, we can see that they're trying to do some positive engagement. They're reaching out and sponsoring events. So while this is happening, as Chris Martin, who is the president of the Pride group within ExxonMobil, says, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say the whole place is loosening up. I think what's changed is that we've been able to show there's a business advantage to the company. So this is somebody who's an employee of ExxonMobil and a member of this chapter, and we can hear in his quote that was in the article the business case coming out. It's not that ExxonMobil all of a sudden says this is the way to be a good corporation, but rather this is the way to enhance our bottom line. So that will bring me to some of the criticisms of this business case here. And as we heard before when we were discussing the praises for it, is that it has the potential to reduce people to a single dimension of their identity, a dimension that they may not think is even relevant to the work they do. I mean, if you're a petroleum engineer, the fact that you're gay, doesn't necessarily change the way you compute algorithms or conduct your daily job. So it can be seen as reductive and insulting to employees to say, I am much more than somebody who is gay. It can also represent tokenism when we look at other types of organizations. Well, okay, we've got our gay person, we're good, now we can move on. And that type of argument falls into a lot of the other criticisms for affirmative action policies where you just bring the person in and they're not necessarily valued, but they are there to represent, no, see, look, we are being diverse. We do have this person who's not a majority member of identity member. It also ignores patterns of oppression. So if we bring people in and say, okay, you're going to benefit our bottom line now, it does nothing to address heteronormativity, problems with the meritocracy, other social issues that a lot of businesses are touting they are making a statement on when really it's just about the bottom line. And using this type of rhetoric can actually limit our ability to bring social justice arguments back into the discussion. So if we keep on promoting, this is good for business, this is good for business, it's about the bottom line, the more we bring up, but it's also the right thing to do, or think about the way this makes people feel rather than how it helps them perform better, all those types of arguments, the humanist argument, can be left out of it and be difficult to bring back in. And sometimes we don't want, or there isn't a clear link to a money motive, right? And does there need to be? And that's a big question a lot of organizations and individuals in society have to face is, if something doesn't make financial sense for us or is at least moot on that point, do we bother with it anymore? Do we try to examine the moral argument behind it? So those are some of the criticisms that the business case is really facing. So in the last little bit of my talk here, I wanted to mention some of the current research I'm doing that's related to the bottom line. I'm involved in a research project right now where I'm interviewing. I have a graduate student with Marcella McCluskey over in the communication department who's helping me, and we're interviewing females who have same-sex desires about their workplace experiences. Now, I want to give you a little bit of insight into that phrase, females with same-sex desires, because you're like, well, why don't you just say lesbians? Well, because we know through talking to people that people who have same-sex desires don't necessarily all identify as gay or queer or lesbian or even want to affiliate themselves with a label, because all of those labels have political connotations with them. And they say, well, I'm married to a woman, but I don't like to call myself, or I don't think of myself as a lesbian. What does that make me? So using the phrase same-sex desire is the most inclusive phrase that I've been able to come to work with people. And I also say female rather than woman to differentiate between gender identity and then biological sex, because there are some women within our study who say they are gender queer, or like, I guess I'm female, but I don't know, I don't really say, well, I'm a woman, but people, when they see me, they say, oh, there's a woman right there. So that's kind of the population we're working with. And we've done 13 interviews so far, 12 of which took place before a same-sex marriage became legal in the United States, and the majority of the women interviewed were working within states that did not have federal law protecting them as a class of people. And we've had one since then, and it was interesting to hear a little bit of the change and discussion of her workplace experiences. But the preliminary results that we've come to so far is that these females, and I get into the habit of saying women as well, perceive their sexual identity as both an asset and a liability to their position in the workplace. So they were experiencing a little bit of a paradox here, where I could, on one hand, say this is really great for me, but the other hand, this can lead to some big problems for me. And it was constructed as an asset when it led to specialized knowledge or increased identification or empathy with the people they were working with. So a lot of the women we talked to worked in helping, I call them helping professions. So counseling, criminal justice, where they worked with inmates to rehabilitate them, drug and alcohol abuse counseling, teachers, a number of librarians who said that actually the field of library science is really a safe place for a lot of LGBT individuals because of the desire for information to spread and for people to become informed and well-known. They just considered it a lot more liberal and accepting of LGBTQ individuals. And so they said by working with certain populations, they knew more about what it was like for those people. Maybe they knew where the resources were for LGBTQ individuals, or they could empathize even with people who weren't of that same sexual orientation, but who experienced discrimination, or experienced bullying, or experienced some sort of stress related to their identity. So for these women in particular, that could be an asset. They felt that their identity made them a better counselor in some ways. But it's important to know that not all these women said they had experienced or could think of a time when they felt disadvantaged for their sexual orientation within the workplace. So they're like, well, I've never experienced it, but I know that it's always a risk. And so that kind of led us into this idea that it was also seen as a liability. That even though my coworkers are great and nobody cares that I'm gay, I know that and this is using a phrase that one of the women used, is that it could be an open season on gays at any time. And this was particularly during the time when Sam Brownback repealed protection for sexual orientation, which had been put forth in an executive action for Kevin Sebelius. So now it's back in the House and they're saying, well, the legislature should decide this rather than an executive action. But that change really scared that participant there. She said, it could be great in here, but when I walk out on the street, I don't know what's going to happen. And if something happens there, I might not be able to come to work the next day, which is a pretty scary thought considering that we're in a developed country where we say that we want to protect people from discrimination and be accepting. So there was always a threat to the livelihood and personhood because they could be fired in most of the states where the people lived for being gay. And they said that there were threats to their interpersonal relationships. One story of a woman who had a friend who was straight in the workplace. She thought that they were really good friends, in fact. And then she was going to get married and invited this friend to her wedding. And a few days went past after the invitation was sent out, and she came back and said, I don't know that I can go to your wedding. She's like, well, why can't you? Is it like, do you have something going on that day? She's like, well, I just don't know if there are going to be enough straight people there. She's like, what do you mean? She's like, well, who would I talk to? Yeah. And you know, their relationship was not strong enough to withhold the conversation that ensued afterward. The participant used a number of strong words to describe the friend afterward, and needless to say, she felt very insulted that her friend couldn't imagine interacting with a lot of gay people at one time, or would assume that because she was gay, that everyone else she knows must be gay as well. So there was a threat to those interpersonal relationships when they were out, and there was also that threat present when they weren't out. So that fear of, if this person figures out, or if I tell them that I'm gay, because I'm female, I'm very feminine, they're probably not going to assume that I'm gay. If they find out, will they still like me? Will they still work with me? Will they say bad things about me behind my back? The threat was there. And there was also the threat to the professional image. A few women that I talked to spoke to worked with children, and they thought that that was difficult for them because the parents of those children, if they had a problem and for somehow learned of their sexual orientation, they could be seen as damaging to their children, right? If you work with this counselor or if you talk to this teacher, I'm not going to like that, so I want you not to be in that class. And so if a teacher, for example, has parents who are not allowing their children to be in the class, that's going to damage their professional image and damage their ability to excel within the profession that they've chosen. So constructed as an asset and a liability. If you or someone you know might be interested in contributing to this data pool, I have my cards here and I'm willing to speak with you all more about the surveys that, or not the surveys, the interviews we're conducting. We're trying to get about 10 more interviews before we start working further on publications. But we're using a snowball sample, which means we are not going and approaching people and saying, hey, I think you're gay, do you want to be interviewed by me or something like that, but rather we're just trying to spread the word that these are the qualifications or demographics that we're looking for, and if you're interested, please come to us. So, all right, that brings me up. Perfect, 30 minutes, 10 seconds. So I want to open this up more to questions and comments about the business case, about my research, about ExxonMobil, or anything else.
I just want to make a comment that just this big umbrella of LGBTQ, ExxonMobil in the workplace doesn't even begin to talk about the discrimination that females get on top of, the label. And if there's any color involved, that's another one. So there's lots of layers. It can't just be gay people in Exxon. I mean, it was just a very broad discussion of that. And I think it merits looking within the layers of LGBTQ, what's going on, if you really wanted to do it in depth.
And a lot of research in that falls under kind of diversity research, that general category. There is definitely a trend to consider more intersectionality. So not just sexual orientation, but race, class, education, ability. How do these different layers of identity interact and influence each other? And how are they in a lot of ways inseparable for people? So that's a very good comment, observation.
I have a question about your research. You said that you'd spoken to women in a lot of helping professions. Is that just because of the places that you sort of advertise that you're talking about this topic, or is there any intentionality there?
Part of it is a result of the snowball sampling. So if I post a flyer in a public library and I have a librarian respond to it, she may know other librarians because that's within her social or professional network, and they would be recommended to me. But that's not, there's a flyer up by the bathrooms at the Walgreens on Vine. There's a flyer at Mocha's right now, and when I first did my round of interviews, I did a lot of coffee shops, and so it was not necessarily intentional, and more of it is, I think, is a factor of the snowball sampling. And that has to be accounted for when we talk about the research and when we do the write-up, because it might be different for people in different fields. Yeah.
I'm familiar with the LGBT, but when you get to the Q, is this a person that is basically kind of confused in somewhat from their biological assignment as far as an identity goes?
Queer is another common descriptor to just talk about both gender identity or sexual orientation. That's not necessarily heterosexual.
It's almost redundant because you have gay in there already in the LGBT.
Did you want to offer a comment?
No, I just think you need to stand with him after you talk.
Okay.
There's an entire alphabet out there.
Yeah,
there is.
Yeah.
It's getting long.
I'll get Whitney in just a second, but I want to say one more comment about that. So the act of naming is fairly controversial. And so to say you are gay or you're a lesbian has a lot of connotation with it. And so queer it's become more popular in probably the past 10 or 15 years to move away from some of the stigma or political associations of other words. But Whitney, did you have another perspective you wanted to share?
No, I was just going to say there's other gender or sexual orientations besides just the LGBTQ. There's asexuality and then pansexuality, and a lot of people don't know about either of those. So.
Yeah.
And one thing I'll say about some of the arguments that were already presented here is that organizations may not be out to get people in particular, and discrimination may be happening out of ignorance of things that affect other people, or they might even have good intentions of wanting to help people but do it in a way that offends people they're trying to help. And doesn't necessarily make them bad organizations, but just means that there needs to be a greater conversation on the subject so that everyone can openly express, well, what's going on? How does this policy affect you? How does the language we use to draft that policy affect you? So when questions like this are offered, it just, I think, means that the conversation needs to be happening more. And there's even a group on campus. Oh gosh, I wish Marcella was here because she went to a few meetings. But their very first meeting is a discussion of the alphabet, so to speak. And every person, when they introduce themselves, gives their preferred personal pronouns. So you don't have to just be he or she. And all those types of things help raise awareness about it so that we don't have to feel uncomfortable when talking to each other, like, well, I don't know if this person identifies as male or female or something in between. I don't know this person's sexual orientation. Is it appropriate for me to ask if I'm wondering, or things like that. Is anyone a member of that organization? Do you feel comfortable sharing the name of it? I can't remember if it's just...
I'm not a member, but I work with the Gay Straight Alliance.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
There we go. I couldn't remember if it was called Pride or Gay Straight Alliance. Yeah. The group of Exxon employees that are part of their Pride chapter, one of the things that was discussed even in the article was that I think it was like 700 members of that group, but they can't distinguish necessarily who is considered gay or straight or what those identities are, because everybody can be a part of those groups. You don't have to be part of the alphabet, so to speak, and not be an ally. So that's important to know too. Yeah.
I just have a question on your research. Just I'm curious because you were mentioning only, I guess, females or people who identify as female. Is that specifically just because of snowballing, or are you also interested in any other individuals that would identify it?
Well, first I'll say that the perspectives of other people I do believe are valuable and worthy of study and presentation, having those voices heard. The reason why this study specifically looks at people who identify as female is attempt to get at part of that intersectionality mentioned before. It's difficult to do a study that does 3, 5, 10 matrices, and so for this one we said, okay, well, let's limit it first to female, because a lot of the research that we read during the literature review covers the whole group, and we do know that things like race and gender affect the way people experience discrimination, affect the likelihood of experiencing discrimination. And so the studies that did limit it to one particular sex, most of them were on gay men. So figured, let's bring in perspective of more gay females to help complement and compare, change the way we think about things if they're different. So.
A lot of the research that I do read is mostly on males, not necessarily females. So I was assuming that's where you were going. I just wanted to.
Yeah. And one of the big differences that I've been seeing in the data and talking with females is that more of them say they can easily pass. Or even when they're not even attempting to pass, people just don't assume it because they may be feminine, and they felt like maybe the stereotypical markers of a woman who has same-sex desires are less obvious than that of a lot of men. I mean, that's where some of the things they were saying. I'm not saying that men are more obviously gay when they are, but that was a comment they made, is people just don't know how to read my relationship. They see a picture of my wife on my desk and say, oh, is that your sister? Because they don't know how to read that intimacy, even if somebody does appear more masculine, which is kind of the more stereotypical appearance for a woman with same-sex desires.
I think that makes it difficult for people to live because because we associate certain characteristics because of our society and how it's progressed and what was set out as the standard of how a male and a female is to act. And I mean, I've had people come up to me and ask me if someone was gay, and I go, well, no, they're just a very friendly person. And they're like dead set on them being gay. And I mean, 2 years later, they'll still ask me, and I'm like, it's the same answer as it was then, you know? So it makes it very difficult for individuals to live their life without being, you know, under the scope all the time, especially in certain areas, especially in Kansas as well, when that's something that's not seen as often or necessarily portrayed in your hometown or whatnot. And if there is an individual who is gay or who identifies or listens to a different type of music or dresses a different way, you know, that person has been pointed out and they're known for years as that individual, whether they change or not, move to another city or something like that. So it makes it those norms that we've set up, makes it very difficult.
And raising awareness about LGBTQ issues in some way helps, but also hinders, because we have people thinking about it more, and so it makes them wonder more. But then it also increases the chance that if somebody maybe doesn't fit the, you know, a gender or sexual stereotype exactly, they're wondering, why is my sexuality so important for everybody to know about? Like, why does this have to be our topic of conversation? I want to be protected, but this does not have to be the basis of our relationship, is you understanding what it's like to be me. So, I mean, you can never have a perfect avenue for these sorts of things, and it's sometimes just the growing pains of progress.
If somebody doesn't speak up and make an issue out of it and put it in your face, then everybody's going to sweep it under the rug. So that's why, you know, I've lived out in the Bay Area for many years, and there's a whole contingent of young queer people that are just in your face. But it's good, because otherwise, again, you know, it's just going to be, oh, well, why do you have to, you know, people go, well, why do you have to put it in my face? Well, you need to see how bad it is, you know, and that's their position. And I'm proud of them, you know.
It seems like you're saying, though, as far as the difference between coming out or whatever, it's not an honesty thing. It's kind of a difference between a public and a personal space of an individual. It's the way I would look at it. Since I've seen more rhetoric that has LGBT, I'm thinking that we've discarded the Q or not looked at it as anything but maybe demeaning. And so as it comes into vote in usage, it's going to be something that has to be accepted again. And there's like no reference as to what you can say to be politically correct if you don't see it advertised. And you need to be addressing things under these headings now, you know?
I think the Q is pretty common these days.
It's been a vocabulary that's been kicked around a lot, you know? And it was discarded, at least as far as what I've seen in usage for quite some time. And if we picked it up and used it, you know, it's something I guess that most of us have to pick up again and understand its usage, you know, because we aren't using words to be batting each other over the head. It's just to have an understanding that's common, you know, I mean, primarily.
That's why I study communication, because it's so interesting and complex. People think communication is just, oh, can you say what you mean? But there is a lot of meaning wrapped up in the words we choose to use and how those arguments.
The choice of words makes a lot of difference, you know, for understanding or misunderstanding, you know. So you don't want to become the B for bigot, or whatever, you know. You want to be at least understanding, even if you say deep down aren't completely sold out on one aspect of life or the other, you know. Every person has a life to live here. We're all here for a purpose. So, you know, when it comes down to that, I mean, you've got to live and let live. So if that's an acceptance, I mean, you know, why should we judge ourselves according to what one individual thinks, you know?
I think that's tapping into a little bit more of a social justice argument too, that it's moral, it's good to be accepting of others.
Are you guys, any more questions? No? All right. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It was definitely super good. And if you guys want to talk to her after, I'm sure you have some time. But thank you guys so much for coming to the Times Talk. Again, we have another one tomorrow. It'll be at 12:30, so that's when the food will be here, 12:30, not noon, so remember that. And I was super excited to see you all here today, so let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you for.
What is the subject?